I'll post a link to the YouTube channel in the chat section, and you can see our other videos up there, some good ones of our recent events. I begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we're meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. Although I should acknowledge that the Victorian comrades are now living in a state that does have a treaty. Well done. I pay my respects to elders and leaders past, present and emerging of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners and First Nations all across the continent. We're here on Gadigal land. Welcome, comrades. Feel free to acknowledge the country you're on in the comments. About our event, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Mark, for around 30 minutes. Then we'll have some responses from comrades like Kate Lee from Mafida, and then we'll have a Q&A that's open to everyone, and wrap up around 7. Usually we're very disciplined with our time and wrap up exactly on the hour. Tonight, being our last event for the year, we might go a little bit over time. I hope that's all right with everybody. About our talk tonight, you would have seen in the description of it, Australia's greenhouse gas emissions have been approximately flat since 2021. Unless new government policies are implemented, it will be impossible for Australia to achieve net zero or even net zero emissions by 2050. The slow energy transition and the government's continuing support for new coal and gas fields for export can be attributed to state capture by vested interests, including fossil fuel, fossil transport, financial services and property industries. Vested interests use the same methods to capture the nation state on a much wider range of issues, including human worker rights, housing, gambling, defence, etc. These methods involve revolving door jobs, political donations, concentrated media ownership, so-called think tanks, or think tanks they're sometimes called, inadequately monitored lobbying and culture of neoliberalism. Our guest speaker believes that community-based NGOs acting on each of the big issues could progress their individual causes by forming an alliance to expose and challenge the methods of state capture. Our guest speaker, Dr. Mark Diesendorf, is uniquely qualified to talk about this. He is the Honorary Associate Professor in Environment and Society at UNSW Sydney. Previously, he was Professor of Environmental Science and Founding Director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. His latest book is The Path to a Sustainable Civilisation, Technological, Socio-Economic and Political Change, which is by published by Palgrave Macmillan. He also publishes at markdiesendorf, all one word, .com. He also wrote for Search recently on the need to reduce energy use to meet climate targets, and that's on our website. I'll put the link for that in the chat. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Mark. Thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Luke, and thank you very much to the Search Foundation for organising this webinar. Now, I'm going to share my screen with a bit of help from Luke, and hopefully you'll all be able to see that in a moment. We get rid of that. Oh. Okay, so as you can see, my subject is the role of state capture in the looming climate catastrophe. And most of the emphasis in this presentation is actually going to be on state capture, because we've got most of the technologies we need for the technical part of the energy transition. And we're now reaching a situation where we cannot totally make this transition in a reasonable time without making social and political and economic changes. And the big barriers to those changes are, of course, some very powerful vested interests that Luke mentioned in the introduction. Of course. Just a second while we experiment with the technology to change the slide. I was going to use the button there, but it doesn't seem to.
Yeah. Oh, yep.
Okay.
Well done, Mark.
So we've got to start with the bad news before we talk about what we can actually do. And we're now in a situation where we're facing a whole range of threats to human society as well as to the planet itself. And these threats, in many cases, are getting worse. So on the environmental side, we've got climate change, deforestation, loss of soils and fresh water, and pollution of air, water and soil, and so on. But complementing those are also threats on the social side. So wages are stagnating while prices are rising. There's an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, not only in most of the world, but certainly in Australia. And that we all know that housing is becoming unaffordable, and there is a decline in our basic public services. What is not often mentioned in the mass media is we're now in a situation of a high probability of nuclear war, especially the risk of war between the United States and China. We're also seeing around the world democracy being undermined in many countries, and I would argue including in Australia. And we're also seeing very much in Australia the right for peaceful protest being undermined, particularly in New South Wales and South Australia, but around the country. So we now have a new word for this, and that is polycrisis. So we're facing a polycrisis. Climate change is one major part of that, but I'm going to argue that we actually have to try to deal with all of these simultaneously. So I hardly need to tell you about the threats from climate change, droughts, heat waves, firestorms, floods, hurricanes. It's all happening. The frequency and severity of these impacts is increasing all the time, here in Australia and around the world. However, the good news is, on the technological side, we have a way forward. And the energy transition strategy is pretty clear to most people who are not funded by the fossil fuel or the nuclear industry. And they have four main components: a transition of the electricity system to renewable sources, mostly solar and wind, the electrification of transport and combustion heating, greatly increased energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, and then the social justice concerns, particularly to ensure that workers who are disadvantaged by the transition, workers in the fossil fuel industry and associated industries, should be assisted by government through this transition in various ways. All these measures are technically feasible now. The transition to renewables, the electrification, the energy efficiency, and the non-technical aspects of improving social justice. Together, these actions can cut over 80% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. What is remaining really is in the red at the bottom of the slide. We need to develop an industry to produce renewable fuels, preferably affordable renewable fuels, such as green hydrogen and ammonia, particularly for air and sea transport and for non-energy industrial use. So there's still that to be done on the technological side, but our government seems to be focusing mainly that and not putting enough energy into the four basics that we see above. And I guess we could also include in energy efficiency improving our public transportation in our cities, improving facilities for walking and cycling. All those things are part of creating a more efficient society. Part of the problem is that there is resistance to change, and both major political parties are responding to that resistance. Now, of course, some of that resistance comes from a few fossil fuels, as you can see in the cartoon, but really we mustn't be distracted by these idiots. The real resistance is coming from very powerful political vested interests with enormous political influence. And it isn't just the fossil fuel industry, but the property industry is one of the brakes on making our homes more energy efficient. The nuclear industry wants to be in there slowing down the transition because it's not ready. And of course, the motor vehicle industry that's still based primarily on the internal combustion engine. More broadly, as I'll argue, the whole capitalist system and the economists who support it, as well as the big business and industries that support it, are also a source of resistance. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that state capture is actually responsible for most of the threats, the major threats to the environment and social justice, human rights and worker rights and peace that we're now facing in this polycrisis in the world. And state capture goes far beyond ordinary corruption, where some industry pays off a minister or a public servant. We're talking about major influence on major decisions by governments, by the opposition, by the public service, the media, and other institutions of the nation state. So we are in a situation where these powerful vested interests have gained enormous control, particularly in the last half century or so, assisted by neoliberal economic ideology. And these captors, we've mentioned some of the industries, but we also must think the armaments industry, the finance industry, the property industry, the gambling industry. We see, and the pharmaceutical industries, we see evidence of this capture all the time, even on the mainstream press from time to time. But of course, they won't use the word or the phrase state capture. We also have state capture between countries. The global north has enormous power over the countries of the global south. And through institutions like the US military-industrial complex, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, rich countries exercise very strong control over the economies and the politics of the poorer countries. Well, I couldn't resist putting in this famous photograph of two of our favourite politicians worshipping a lump of coal in Parliament House. And I have to add that the coal was provided by one of the main fossil fuel lobbies in Australia, the Mineral Council of Australia, and out of great consideration, they lacquered the coal so that the politicians wouldn't get their hands dirty. And some of the indications of state capture by fossil fuels are the fact that for the major political parties, for both of them, retiring ministers for energy or resources generally move very rapidly after retirement, almost immediately in some cases, to highly paid jobs in the fossil fuel industry or the fossil fuel industry lobby groups like the Mineral Council of Australia. Under a previous government, both the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister at the time and the senior political advisor were appointed directly from the Minerals Council of Australia. We see both major parties making huge donations, receiving huge donations from the fossil fuel industry. We see a situation where the Australian mass media, the mainstream media, is owned 75% of it is owned by one corporation, News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and their prejudice and their publications against climate science and renewable energy have even been exposed and criticised by one of the Murdoch family, James Murdoch. Another tool of state capture is the manipulation of science, which hasn't actually worked terribly well for the fossil fuel industry, but in some areas, particularly in the United States, it's still a problem. Now, I am going to include state capture by the global military-industrial complex, and in an obvious sense, it's relevant because the world's military is responsible for huge greenhouse gas emissions, particularly the US military, even when it is not fighting a war. And that's a pretty rare situation because the US has been fighting wars pretty well continuously since 1947. But even when it's not fighting wars, it has huge energy requirements and greenhouse gas emissions. In Australia, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is often treated by our ABC as an objective source of information about foreign affairs and defence. And they rarely reveal, perhaps never reveal, that ASPI is funded by the United States government as well as the Australian government and by the weapons industry. A former defence minister was appointed president of a major contractor to our Department of Defence. To make matters worse, before the Australian government joined AUKUS and announced it would buy the nuclear submarines from the US and UK, it was advised by 5 so-called retired US admirals and other senior US members of the administration who were paid consultants to our Defence Department. So they advised the Australian Department of Defence over recent years before the AUKUS announcement was announced by the then coalition government and immediately endorsed by Labor. I would also like to mention state capture by the property development industry, because this is one industry that threatens both social justice and energy efficiency in buildings. Its board is made up of Australia's largest residential and commercial developers. It has campaigned for years for negative gearing and for discounted capital gains tax, which has pushed up the price of housing all around Australia. It has millions of dollars in its annual budgets for advocacy and communications and so-called networking. In other words, for capturing the relevant government, opposition and public service in terms of housing and property developments. And the results have been big increases, continuing increases in prices of housing and rents, the decline in home ownership, state planning effectively by developers, and of course, ugly, environmentally unsound and environmentally damaging projects with insufficient social housing. So we really do have a whole series of threats as a result of state capture, ranging across the environment, social justice and peace and human rights and worker rights. The methods of state capture, Luke mentioned at the beginning. Political donations is one, and very cunningly, the Labor government has used concern about political donations to make it more difficult for independents and small parties like the Greens to actually get elected. That was their response to political donations. I've referred to the revolving door jobs, which occur in the energy and resources area, in defence, right across the board. And I've referred to concentrated media ownership, and one could add to that social media campaigns. The think tanks, I've mentioned ASPI, and of course we should also mention the Institute of Public Affairs. We're also faced with covert lobbying, with opaque consulting, with scientific research being manipulated, although this has mainly been an issue where the tobacco industry has been very successful, and also in terms of diet, the sugary food industry has been enormously successful, and in fact is one of the main supporters of junk food, and also of, incidentally, I should mention fluoridation, which of course is promoted as something that children can eat sugary food without worrying, because they believe they're protected by fluoride in drinking water. Anyway, and yes, sorry. And the last but not least is the whole economics system, which reinforces this situation, capitalism, and especially its extreme form, neoliberalism. The notion that all major policies, decisions by government should be left to the market. Now, I want to show a few of the links between these different threats. And the most obvious link is the link between climate change and social justice. And this champagne glass brings it home very clearly. The red on the top represents the richest 10% of people in the world in terms of, this is the richest in terms of income, and they're responsible for half of all global greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at the middle 40%, most of us are in there, we're responsible for 43%. But if we add them to the richest 10%, we can say that the richest half of the world's population is responsible for about 93% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're going to talk about mitigating, reducing dramatically greenhouse gas emissions, we have to focus on those people and those organizations and businesses, which are the world's biggest emitters. The poorest half of the world is only responsible for about 8% of global emissions. So that's the link between social justice or one of the links between social justice and climate change. But also there's a very strong link between the environment as a whole, including climate change, and capitalism, which is represented by the growth in global GDP in this diagram. So GDP is shown here growing in the orange from 1970 to 2022, and you can see the very close correlation to the growth in materials consumption. This is global materials. We don't have the latest data, but we have data up to 2019, and energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions in the green. The closeness of the correlation is revealed if you look at around 2008, 2009, you see the dip due to the global financial crisis, and then another dip around 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. And this is more than just a correlation. It's easy to establish the causal link between growth in economic activity and growth in the use of materials and energy, and one could add land. So in summary, you don't have to read this slide now. And I should add that I've uploaded this slideshow to my personal website, markdiesendorf.com. It's in the page called Popular Articles, etc. So it's right at the top there if you want to refer to the slideshow. But the main point is made here, which I've already said, is that there are links between all these threats: environmental, social justice, peace, and in fact, the threat to democracy are all linked through some of these links. And this situation is both a threat and an opportunity, because if they're all linked together, it raises the question, is there a strategy that we could use to address all these threats simultaneously? And that's what I'd like to focus on for the rest of my talk. So this is an attempt to illustrate the strategy in very simple terms. I've oversimplified it. At the top, we have the environmental and social threats. And this is where almost all the action takes place from community-based non-government organizations, focusing on the specific issues, which are all important. And without the action at this level, we would be in a much direr state, if I can use the word dire, on the world. But we also need to be aware of the driving forces underneath there. Capitalism, the circle on the left-hand side, and its extreme version, neoliberalism, and state capture. And of course, one could say that really capitalism is also part of state capture and neoliberalism. It creates an economic framework which suits the rich and powerful, which suits a situation where the economic system results in exploitation of the planet and the vast majority of the people on the planet. So capitalism in general and neoliberalism in particular are based on this principle of exploitation in order to enrich a small minority, in order to create enormous profits. And those beneficiaries achieve enormous political power as well as economic power, resulting in state capture. So how can we weaken state capture and capitalism? And one has to say, really, it's obvious, and I'm going to state the obvious, but it's not being done to a significant degree. We need to form alliances between different community-based non-government organizations, environmental, public health, social justice, human rights, trade union, and peace organizations to challenge these driving forces directly. And the way to challenge the driving forces, I suggest, is to attack the methods they use, which are indeed vulnerable to the community, the methods of political donations and revolving door jobs and so on. And many of these methods are very shaky at present. Neoliberalism, for example, failed dramatically during the global financial crisis. Governments had to violate the so-called principles of neoliberalism and create, in Australia, hundreds of billions of dollars and put that money into the economy to keep it going. Political donations and revolving door jobs and concentrated media ownership have been regulated in the past, and some of them are still nominally regulated, but that regulation is not being enforced. So we need to return to that. But there are much bigger issues that also have to be dealt with. And on my website, I list about 9 economic myths, but I'm just going to focus tonight on the first one. That's all we've got time. And that's the myth that endless growth in consumption on a finite planet is feasible and desirable. And the refutation of this myth is quite easy. If we look at the situation where we're exceeding planetary boundaries, that's the orange, exceeding the green of the safe zone in climate change, biodiversity, land system, biochemical flows, and ocean acidification has occurred since this diagram was drawn, is now also exceeded its planetary boundary. So economic activity, particularly economic activity of the wrong kind, is pushing us outside of these planetary boundaries established by sustainability science. And also the close correlation we saw between GDP growth and consumption is another demonstration that we cannot continue with endless growth in consumption on this planet. And that's a very difficult thing to sell because the propaganda of economic growth is so strong, runs right through the community. It's been very well implemented. Let me give you an example from energy in case you think I've forgotten about it. This diagram, I think this is one of the only 2 graphs in the diagram, but the big bar on the left shows the total use of energy in the world, and that includes electricity, transport, and heating, so all energy at the point of use in 2009. And the right-hand bar shows 10 years later the situation. And the horrific thing there is, despite the enormous growth of renewable energy, fossil fuels contributed 80% of world total final energy consumption in 2019, exactly the same percentage as in 2009. And in fact, if we go back to year 2000, it was 80% again. So what's going wrong? It's not the fault of renewable energy, which has grown far beyond expectations. Renewable energy technology growth has been the success story of recent decades. The problem is the growth in consumption, that renewable energy is chasing a retreating target. And if you imagine you're a runner coming into the finishing straight in a 400 meters, and you see the officials running away with the finishing straight, that's the situation. Now, you're an athlete. Imagine you're an athlete. You're going to catch them in the end, but you won't catch them by 2050 in terms of climate change on a global scale. I've argued it's impossible. And it's impossible if consumption growth continues, and we have to come to terms with it. And there are lots of other good arguments to bring consumption under control and to transition to a steady state economy, but I won't go into them now. Let me show you another example. This graph shows the growth. The top line is the growth in total electricity generation in the world from year 2000 to 2019. And you can see that blue line, it grew 1.74 times. Now, renewable electricity over that period grew at a much faster rate. It grew nearly 2.5 times. A faster rate, but starting from a smaller base. And the result was that at 2019, the gap was actually getting bigger. Renewable energy was still getting behind the growth in consumption. Now, fortunately, in recent years, that is now starting to change. I raise this simply to say that the problem is consumption. Renewable energy is growing gangbusters, but it will not, on a global scale, be able to catch total electricity or total energy if consumption keeps growing at current rate. So we have to try and put some limits on this fundamental problem that arises from a capitalist economy. I'm going to make some suggestions for actions that, in fact, are really quite feasible to start the process of putting some controls on capitalism, and in particular, knocking over neoliberalism, which is really now in a very shaky state. And the first thing is to recognize that GDP is not a measure of national well-being. It doesn't measure that at all. It was never intended to measure well-being or welfare in the first place. What we need is a much wider range of well-being measures, environmental, because human beings, our whole existence depends on the natural environment. We are totally dependent on the environment. We need socio-economic measures and a political system that gives people a genuine say in decisions. Now, we've actually seen a very modest move by our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, some time ago to suggest that and to push gently for some other measures of national well-being. And we've also seen the ferocious attacks on him in the Australian Financial Review and elsewhere with such a modest suggestion. If we come down to socio-economic well-being, what most research on sustainability is now recommending is what we call universal basic services or universal public service. In other words, better public health, public education, public transport, public housing, public parks, better low-cost childcare and aged care, providing the basics for a decent society, providing a social wage. And under those conditions, which actually most the Scandinavian countries are far ahead of Australia and the US in this regard. So it's not as if we're talking about some incredible radical transformation. That this will provide a basic quality of life, a basic level of prosperity, so that there's less pressure for this endless growth. In terms of political well-being, we need a strong campaign to control state capture, to attack the methods that the vested interests use, and to destroy those methods and to restore democratic decision-making. I would also argue that we need to introduce a job guarantee with jobs provided by local government and registered community organisations, jobs that are not being provided by the market at present. So we're talking about jobs, caring for the environment, caring for people in a way that is not provided by the market and funded by the federal government. And that will require enormous pressure on the government. We need to transition seriously now towards a circular economy. We call it a leaky circular economy because, well, I certainly aren't convinced that a completely circular economy is possible, but we can do far more than we are doing at present. And that will help the transition to a steady state economy with reduced consumption of energy and materials and land, and ultimately no further growth in population as well. Now, how do we reduce consumption? Well, I've already said the first step is a transition to a circular economy. But we've also seen that it is the rich, certainly the richest half, but particularly the richest 10% and 1%, who are having the biggest environmental impacts. And for social justice reasons as well, we need to shrink that gap between the rich and the poor. And that means reducing the ability of the rich to spend in such vast amounts and to invest in such vast amounts. And so we need to talk about wealth and inheritance taxes, which do exist in a number of countries, a more progressive income tax system, a capital gains tax, and so on. The next step is to remove the horrific subsidies to destructive industries, then to start taxing them seriously and to phase them out. And as I'm sure you're all aware, that in Australia, fossil fuels are subsidised to a level of almost 15 billion, with a B, billion dollars a year in various ways. And this is the result of state capture. Huge amounts of money, huge subsidies going into weapons which are not really weapons that are particularly useful for defending Australia, like submarines that are primarily useful for trying to contain China, an impossible task, in the South China Sea. And we need to, of course, facilitate the creation of green industries and business. So we need that to go beyond just alliances to create a strong social change movement to challenge the methods of state capture. And in terms of a theoretical economic system, there have been enormous advances in recent decades in ecological economics, or its more recent version, social ecological economics. Or if you look to the bottom right, you've got Kate Raworth's diagram of the donut economy, which again integrates action on the environment and social justice, except that when I pasted it in, it's in mirror language, so you're going to have to hold it up to a mirror to read it. So to end, really, if we start feeling a little bit depressed, we can think of the successful social movements that have taken place. Votes for women, civil rights for Black Americans, the expulsion of the British imperial colonial power for India, the resistance to wars, for example, the overthrow of the Serbian authoritarian ruler Milosevic, non-violent overthrow, and so on. There are many successful examples, and we need to learn from them how we can non-violently, but forming a very powerful political social movement to overcome state capture and create not a utopia, but a better world. And thank you for your attention. And there's more material in the book and on my website, markdiesendorf.com. All yours.
Good. Thank you so much, Mark. And hopefully everyone got a lot out of that. Very comprehensive setting out of both the issue, and good to talk about some of the possible solutions and ways we can move ahead with it. I'll ask Kate Lee if she's okay to give it just a response before we move to our Q&A. Many people here will know Kate is the executive officer, the executive director of AFIDA, Unionated Broader FIDA. Not sure if Kate is happy for me to say that she's going to be soon leaving that role, but I think that's public knowledge, and has extensive experience, obviously, through Unionated Broader FIDA with the particularly our region, but also broader further afield in terms of dealing with, we wanted to get your perspective, particularly on international, how this plays out internationally and what you've seen in your work for AFIDA and on that front. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Luke, and good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. Good. Look, well, thanks. And I'm only just going to make a couple of comments because I can see there's already a lot of engagement in the chat, and I think people have got lots of questions and comments of Mark. But I just want to, first of all, thank Mark. As always, a really cogent and very succinct kind of argument that Mark has put there. And I just want to also say that first of all, there's lots of, good stuff on Mark's website, and I encourage people to go and have a look because there's heaps more information there. But, I think the thing that is lost to many of us across progressive movements and also in the environment movement, and what I deeply appreciate Mark has put tonight, is, I guess, the need for us as progressive movements to really integrate the environmental and the social justice challenges before us. And I think this is the part that really jumps out from me from what Mark has said tonight. Mark, I really loved your what you put forward as our energy transition strategy, which you said has to include renewable energy, electrification, energy efficiency, and social justice. I really love that. And we don't see enough of this being put forward as the coherent strategy. We're siloed across progressive movements, and we don't actually see these together as a whole in a sense, what we must fight for if we want to save the planet and effectively humanity, which I think we all agree the climate crisis is so deep, we must do this. But often our social justice demands sit separately to this, and we can't afford to do that. And I think Mark has put this really strongly, and you put it in a way that a new penny has dropped for me tonight in terms of the AFIDA agenda in this as well. So I really loved that. Thank you. Absolutely, totally support your initial premise and your closing premise that we as community-based organisations, as progressive movements, must form strong alliances to challenge the status quo, and in particular, all those threads of state capture, because they infiltrate all of our movements in very similar ways. The media concentration, the lobbyists, the occupation of the political positions, the think tanks, the manipulated research, they occupy the spaces in the environment movement and in the social justice movements equally. And we are, in a sense, dumb if we don't, as progressives, come together and really see this. We have to see this, and you've illuminated this for us tonight. So thanks, Mark. Just briefly, in terms of the international struggles, many of you already know about this, and you're involved to many extents in this. But this year we've seen uprisings, the Gen Z uprisings, spring up in our region and beyond. So in our region, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Nepal, Philippines, Madagascar in particular, for example, and they are all about elements of state capture. They're about corruption, and the deep corruption that exists in many countries in our region, and with a demand from younger people to say, we are sick and tired of this form of state capture, we're sick and tired of corruption, we're sick and tired of being excluded from wealth in our society, and they're challenging capitalism. I don't see enough in our region of the coming together of the social movements across environment organisations and social justice movements and the trade union movements to challenge it in the way that Mark asks us to do. And I think AFIDA and others, we need to really have a hard look at how we collaborate with in solidarity and put some of these questions before our comrades in the region. And in fact, in some places, like in Nepal, where those Gen Z movements were so, they're really, it was very unorganized, and really just exploded around those corruption questions. But trade unions were also targeted by Gen Z. They saw them as part of the problem and part of the institutional problem. So I think, our trade unions in the region also, and in Nepal, I know, are going through a very deep reflection at this time as well. So I'll leave it there, Luke, but just want to thank Mark for bringing those threads together and really challenging us to work more deliberately cross movement, because we must, and because those forces against us are one and the same across all of our movements. So thank you, Mark.
Well, Kate, and I was going to invite one more comment before we go to Q&A, which is from John Wishart. And many of you may have seen that John was locked on the weekend for the Rising Tide Protestival. Not sure what your camera is doing right at this point, John, but perhaps we can just hear you and it'd be okay from there. But John's former co-convener of the South Australian Greens, and as I said, directly involved in direct action just over this weekend at the Rising Tide Protestival. So go ahead, John, with your comment.
Thanks, Luke. I'm sorry, my camera doesn't seem to be working. But you can hear me, I think.
We can. All good.
That's great. Look, I'm on Kaurna country in Adelaide, I acknowledge that and the Aboriginal people and elders of this area, and I know that everyone is in very different countries around Australia, also on land that's never been ceded. Mark, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I agree with many of the things that you said. I think it's a terrific presentation. I just make one comment about the movements, and then perhaps just raise the example of Rising Tide briefly. There's no doubt that we have to find the way of building alliances across the various movements, social, economic, gender, etc., First Nations, if we are going to have any chance of defeating the power of capital in the way that we face it at the moment. And I'd say that we've got a long way to go there. Obviously, we are still very siloed, as Kate was talking a little bit in her remarks. And I think one of the biggest areas of difficulty is how we are able to get a position where there is more consciousness amongst trade union leaders and delegates of the sort of perspective that you put forward, Mark. We are very much a long way from that. And unfortunately, if we're talking about state capture and the integration, unfortunately, many of the union leaders and many of the unions are very embedded in that state capture because they are part of the transmission moving between unions, ALP, boardrooms, advisory positions, and this is a big problem, and a lot of work needs to be done, I think, to develop that, and I think we've got to work on that. I actually think that the starting point for some of that is to talk about just transitions, and as the economic crisis bites harder and harder, to try and develop the perspective that workers will not have a decent standard of living unless we challenge capital as it is and the obscene taxation system that you referred to in your remarks. I think that's an important point of entry for a dialogue and for trying to develop educationally an awareness of what's needed from the trade union area. My other comment is to say that as some of you know, I've been very involved in the Rising Tide movement. I think this is a good example of a movement which is trying to make the alliances and to be more than just an environment protest movement. Its demands include that 78% of the profits from fossil fuel industry goes to fund a transition and to fund public services and community services that we know we all badly need. And that would obviously mean a big change in our taxation system with capital gains and so forth. So the demands of Rising Tide is to confront the fossil fuel companies directly, but to have a program which links with economic needs and social needs. And I have to say that big efforts are being made by Rising Tide to form alliances with First Nations people, with the queer community, with people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so that whilst the focus is on stopping, at the moment, stopping coal in particular, it has a much broader agenda. And it's very exciting to see people from, young people and older people, from diverse backgrounds joining in and taking part in the blockade that has just been concluded at Newcastle. Maybe my last thing, Luke, if I've got time, is just to underline the fact that those in the environment movement that are taking on fossil fuels directly have been confronted by repressive legislation. You mentioned, Mark, New South Wales and South Australia. I couldn't agree more. They have enormously increased penalties for public protest. I won't go into the details on South Australia, but the South Australian government, which is a Labor government, is very much an advocate and a champion of the fossil fuel industry. In fact, our Minister for Mines and Energy, at a conference 2 years ago of the APPEA, the oil and gas industry, said that the South Australian government was at their service. It was followed by repressive legislation to try and curb protests that had been made by Extinction Rebellion around that particular conference. Very undemocratic, condemned by the civil liberties, condemned by actually the South Australian Union movement, sweeping legislation that was brought through because of a relatively minor protest, environment protest, at the time of that APPEA conference. So it's certainly a big battle, but I think what you've said, Mark, is definitely the way forward. And thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much, both Kate and John, for your comments. I'd just like to add very briefly that I'm a member of the Sydney Retired Unionist Group, and we're a small group, but we're organising a campaign to try and, in a small way, bring together some of the different groups, environmental, social justice, peace, etc., starting by signing an open letter to the Prime Minister, which we've produced. So if you out there belong to an organisation and would like to see our open letter, which we have not yet published, and perhaps if your organisation would like to join in signing it, that would be fantastic. You can contact me through my website.
And yeah, we'll get that around as well, get the link for that too. Thank you very much for all the comments as well. And I should recognise our members and other comrades who've joined us online and in the room. I've got there's some questions here in the comments. I'll just check in the room as well. Do anyone have a comment or a question for Mark right away?
Oh, no, it'd be good to go to the...
Go on, yeah, no worries. You can raise your hand, or as people have asked questions already in the chat, so I'll take some of those questions there. And thank you for the other, the comments as well. Jane's comment about Rising Tide as well, and certain Mark Diesendorf perhaps a relation.
Yeah. My brother's online, I see.
I think John worked with my cousin Jeff, actually. So the question, interesting question there about from Wayne McMillan. Thank you, Wayne, for your question. What does Mark think about community assemblies as a means of getting more community participation? And Greg added to that, randomly selected mini publics should be regularly and routinely be central to making governance decisions. So changing some of the structures. Another comment there, I think from Greg as well, about our institutions being very old. I'm reminded of I think it's Edward Wilson quote about us having Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions with Star Trek technology, and it's a terrifying mix. What do you think about some of those ideas around changing the way we do democracy, using smaller assemblies, using random selection, things like that?
I'm certainly in favour of that, but this is much more difficult to achieve than the few modest first steps to changing the system that I've suggested. So I'd be delighted if we first. The problem is the power of the vested interests who are operating through whichever major party is in government in Australia, and they would not be keen to have community assemblies actually having any kind of influence. But I'm all in favour of growing those assemblies. I think one of the big problems that I haven't mentioned is communication, that we're in a situation where the mass media rule most of the communications between people in this country. And as I said, they're controlled by, to a large degree, by News Corp. And the challenge is to get the message that we can actually do things in a better way with community assemblies, with universal public services, with job guarantees. Job guarantees were even suggested for farmers during the pandemic. Farmers really thought it would be a great idea for them to have a job guarantee, but it didn't really go anywhere. So look, there are lots of ways forward, but we are facing a very powerful power structure. And I think we need to simultaneously combat that power structure, but also offer people the vision of a better world where we do have a job guarantee, where we do have universal basic services, where we have a better environment. And that's the positive side. And the challenge then is to get that message through in the face of an enormous propaganda situation. But we have to try. And I think we have a message. I mean, people say to me, what am I going to get out of these changes you're suggesting? Well, universal basic services and a job guarantee is a fantastic start. So I've changed. I'll leave that.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for the shifting camera work. It's just the way we've got it set up here today. Oh, it's all right. Bit of an alarm going off. Thank you for all your kind comments about the presentation in the chat. I might throw in one question before we are at 7 o'clock, and I said we would try to stick to time, but perhaps we can indulge ourselves for another 5 minutes. Nothing succeeds like success, and when people are under a lot of economic pressure, and particularly young people are struggling just to keep their heads above water, and working age people, so momentum really means a lot. So getting those those initial wins that will then chip away at the power of the fossil fuel industry, chip away at the power of the military industrial complex. If you had to pick one a win to get us to get the momentum going in the democratic favour, which one would you pick?
Well, that's a difficult question. I would certainly suggest that attacking revolving door jobs would be a great start. It would reduce the conflict of interest situation in some of our major decision makers. But at the same time, I think we need a combination of grassroots action at the grassroots level and action, political action to force governments to make appropriate changes. We need that combination. I think one of the areas that needs to be addressed much more strongly by all the community groups is housing. And this is such an obvious, serious issue right now. I could see the potential for non-violent direct action with people putting caravans on vacant land and seizing that land non-violently and staying there and saying, we want a place to put small houses, mini houses, tiny houses, as they're called, which are basically greatly improved caravans. That would be one example. But we're now in such a serious situation in a whole range of issues that I think non-violent direct action is very important, and it needs to go beyond marching in the streets. Although, I mean, I have to say that the march across the Harbour Bridge for Palestine was a fantastic experience. But we can't do that every time. We need to be practical as well.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, as we're winding up, I'd like to say something.
No, we have hit 7 o'clock, and
Okay.
so I will turn to our Vice President.
Oh,
Jackie.
sorry, no. Well, it's not in my capacity as Vice President, but I will thank Mark, it was fantastic, and Kate and John for their contribution, and also everyone for joining us. But what I just want to make sure is that from the Search Foundation's point of view, this is reinvigorating our work around climate action, and that we want to continue this really important conversation and to engage in how we do strategize and work towards a coherent sort of movement. And so I think that you will all hear from us in the very near future about how we will continue this conversation. And it may be that we do have reinvigorate our climate action group, or we do something that's in another sort of vision of that. So please don't see this as just a one-off, and Mark's work has been fantastic, and John and everyone's work in this area, and Kate is really important, and we want to be able to draw on that to move this movement forward. So so we will, from Search at least, we will be continuing this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
I will, it being 7 o'clock or past 7:03, I will just change the spotlight there so we can see me a bit more clearly. Thank Mark. I might echo the words of Jane Drury, who's put in the chat, summarise it perfectly for me. Thanks, Mark, for such an informative overview of the impacts of capitalist consumerism and the importance of recognising state capture. That's well said, Jane. Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming along. And we'll be in touch. As I said at the start, we will post this as a video on our YouTube channel. You can see on our YouTube channel our recent forum with Bhaskar Sankara from Jacobin magazine and Dr. Jim Stanford. And we will be posting this week the speech by Angelo Gavrielados at our AGM, which directly referenced that bridge walk. So that'll come out this week as well. Please share those. You know, it's great that we've had lots of people on the call tonight and here in the room, but with the power of social media, we can get to many, many more people. And also go and check out markdiesendorf.com and share that around as well to your networks, please. Thank you all, and thank you, Mark.